you've transcended a liminal threshold into History Fuzz, a realm of contemplative inquiry in which leading researchers discuss the motivations, tools and skills of the skywatchers, surveyors, architects and builders who delineated monumental landscapes with awe-inspiring structures, enshrining their diverse cosmic chronicles in stone. I'm your host, Ashley Cowie. You can unlock videos, maps, articles, and enjoy early ad-free new episodes by becoming a member on historyfuzz.com, where you can also apply to join our team exploring and filming archaeology documentaries in the Andean highlands of Colombia. Charles Stanish was a professor of anthropology and director of the Cotsen Institute of Archaeology at UCLA for 20 years before he served as executive director of the Institute for the Advanced Study of Culture and the Environment at the University of South Florida. Having conducted extensive research into trade, war, and labor organization and human cooperation within prehistoric societies in Peru, Bolivia, and Chile. In this episode, Charles explores a matrix of astronomical alignments and geoglyphs within Peru's Chincha and Nazca valleys. We learn how emerging ruling classes conducted elaborate open-air theatrical productions and provided great feasts for pilgrims in a political spectacle to garner widespread support. After outlining the underlying archaeoastronomy within assemblies of mounds, platforms and straight roads, Charles discusses Cusco's controversial Seki system of alignments and shrines, demonstrating how his empirical approach to Inca alignments and astronomy challenges the earlier works of structuralists. You'd be wise to abandon the precepts of Western philosophy before entering this ancient world of lost alignments, as we'll be following a more diverse form of mind map, based on raw Andean cosmovision, as charted by Professor Charles Stanish. When was the Chincha Valley first settled, and where do you think those people came from?
Well, the earliest evidence we have is around 1500 BC. Undoubtedly, there have been people in the Chincha Valley for many millennia, 6, 7, 8, 9,000 years. What we discovered was there was this massive sedimentation episode, so all the early sites are covered.
Where did the sediment come from?
It started around 2,500 years ago, and there were massive El Niños combined with the first agriculture, which cut the trees. And what you had is anthropogenic and natural effects to give extraordinarily massive sedimentation, higher than Maya and about the same as Byzantine agriculture in Romania or something like that.
We're experiencing an El Nino right now this year in Colombia, and when you see the word El Nino on the news, you never really get the profundity of that, but right now we're losing plants in our garden because the dust, if you walk up the path, the dust is so great that it's covering all the plants and the leaves just aren't functioning. So
wow,
I can sympathize with the effects of a prolonged El Nino effect. Anything more than one season and you're greenless.
Yeah. Well, the geologists have picked up intensified El Nino 2,500 years ago, and that lasted for about 800 years. We found that up on the North Coast, not us, but my colleagues, and we've confirmed it in the South Coast. So there was lots and lots and lots of sedimentation that's covered up. It's even covered up Paracas villages. It's amazing. Yeah.
Would you define the key features of the mound and geoglyph complex that you can actually measure that haven't been covered in sands?
Well, what you have is you have a series of very large pyramids, technically platform mounds, but pyramids in the lower valley. And there are 4 large clusters of these, some quite massive, the largest being 1 million cubic meters of earth. It's massive. These are all paracas, and they cluster together. Everything else underneath them has been covered up. So we don't find anything else in the lower valley. But then up on the Pampa, desert Pampa above Chincha Valley,
Yeah.
we have a 40 square kilometer geoglyph complex, as well as a whole series of small and moderate sized mounds and structures within that complex.
Yeah.
And so they're linked. And it's not coincidental that there are 4 clusters of Paracas sites in the lower valley. And then there's 4 major sites in the upper valley where all the geoglyphs lead to.
The geoglyphs, are you saying they're linear generally?
Yeah, they're all linear. This is interesting. They're no figural, not like Nazca. And the figural geoglyphs in Nazca are Paracas as well. And since we've dated the geoglyphs in Chincha to 400 to 200 BC, which is late Paracas, we think that the figural geoglyphs are all early.
Earlier than the linear?
Yeah. Well, I think they're, let's say the linear and the figurals come in at the same time, but then they stop building the figurals. And then they really go heavily on the linear and the trapezoids, the big trapezoid geoglyphs.
What's a trapezoid geoglyph?
Oh, it would be non-parallel lines that start at the same point and they go out at an angle, and then they wall it off. So you have a giant quadrangle that's in a trapezoid shape.
Do you find a majority of the lines have astronomical significance, or have you considered that many might be related to significant mountains or water features relating to cosmology? How do you think the cosmology versus astronomy balance lies there?
Personally,
Yep.
we have solstice marking
Okay.
for both the sunrise and the sunset in both solstices. That we have.
Yeah.
I've not found anything else.
Nothing lunar?
No. I mean, you can't see the geoglyphs at night, so it would be hard to use the geoglyphs to cite something at night, unless you put fire on them, but we would have found evidence of that.
Or water?
Well, yeah, but the Andean sky is so bright that many Andean peoples didn't talk about star clusters. They talked about dark patch clusters. It's so incredibly bright. Mm. So my theory is, and I'm sure I'll be wrong at some point, but my theory is that the solstice marking is almost exclusively a calendrical system to mark the different feast times during the annual cycle.
In Colombia, the rulers, the Kazakis, used food, drugs, and sex in that order to amass power. Mm-hmm. Do you see signs of that associated with the mound system and the geoglyphs down there?
Yeah, that's well said. The whole political economy of Paracas seems to be based upon competitive feasting, like the kula ring or like the potlatching. And we have a vast literature in anthropology that illustrates how this works. And it's universal, from Beowulf to the Trobriand Islands to the Maori to the Kwakiutl. We know how it works. These are in non-state societies where emerging leaders or emerging chiefs gain power not by getting rich in a capitalist system where you buy and sell for a profit, but by having more friends.
Yeah.
The more friends you have, and that's the term used by like the Trobrians, right? It's a good term. Mm. So the more partners you have, the richer you are, because then you have more stuff to give away. And the more stuff you have to give away, you turn that into debt obligation, labor debt obligation. And you can't store wealth if you don't have money for the most part, right? Mm. So what you do with your wealth is you give it away. There's a reason that in ancient times, people made these absolutely beautiful objects, used them for their life, and then when they died, they stuck them all in tombs, right? Because they'll have no value if they're not associated with somebody else. They don't have any exchange value, right? But once you get to state level societies, then you see the tombs of the commoners become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, because what they're doing is these commodities have value. So the basis of a pre-state, non-state economy, I think around the world, is this idea of competitive feasting. Who can get the most number of people together in their place at the same time, and who can really whoop it up. And you create theatrical landscapes, you redistribute food, you have the people in your local faction, as the old British social anthropologist used to say, make pudding for 6 weeks for people to come in. So it's food, I'm sure it's sex, I'm sure it's marriage partners, I'm sure it's communication. It's people having a good time, people calling truces in conflict. You don't see that. You see that everywhere in the ethnographic record. People are vastly more sophisticated than we give them credit for, because they can be fighting, hitting, and raiding for 9 months, and then they say, okay, now we stop and we get together. It's in everybody's self-interest, and they do that. So that's the basis of the Paracas political economy. It's utterly fascinating.
From what time period was that system at play?
Began around 800 BC.
Okay.
Ended around 200 BC.
Oh, really?
And then you have a culture called Topara that comes in between Paracas and Nazca. We used to think that they were just kind of a collapsed Paracas system, but I'm beginning to think there was some immigration going on there. But at any rate, the Paracas system collapsed around 200 BC. It was not replaced with anything very complex, but the whole political center of southern Peru shifted to Nazca. And so the Nazca peoples around 180, 200, they really got going around 400, 500. They were booming with the massive, massive geoglyph complex. Now, what's fascinating about that is Paracas geoglyphs are everywhere, or early horizon geoglyphs are everywhere, up and down the coast from Ecuador down into central Chile. Geoglyphs everywhere. This was a widespread phenomenon. The Paracas did it on a massive scale, as did some cultures in the North Coast. But once this collapsed, in the what we call the early horizon, and we get into the early intermediate period, Nazca times, it all shifts to Nazca. It all shifts to Nazca. Up in the north, they become state societies, and they just take over everything.
And how big a region is Nazca?
Nazca's pretty big. It's probably like the size of the state of Washington, something like that. It's quite large. Quite large. Yeah, it's big.
Going back 5 minutes, you brushed over the word theatre, and in some of your previous works, you've talked extensively on how theatre helped form and maintain complex societies. You said if people were working the lines and platforms, that this helped evolve cooperation. And I think that's a wonderful word, working. What do you think that means? How do you think the lines were perhaps worked by people? What function did they play?
That's a great question, by the way. If you imagine an area where people were competing for other people to be their allies, all around the Andes. So people from Paracas are going to go up to the highlands. People from the highlands are going to come down to Paracas. So at a certain point during your annual cycle, it's Paracas's turn, or it's Chincha Valley's turn, right? So all these groups, we see today, like in Cusco, for these saint festivals, going up to these mountains. All these groups go together. Villages go together. Kin groups go together. They're called Ayu in the Andes, as you know.
Yeah.
They all go together, and they have their own patch of land. And everyone knows it. And that's what they use. And then they build their temporary structures there, and they stay for several weeks. What they're doing in Paracas is, at a certain time of the year, they're coming down, all these groups from all over, and they are building their own sets of lines. I believe the trapezoids and the big parallel lines are like dance grounds, places where people feast. You have all these mounded structures in the lines. Some oriented to the solstice, others or whatever, but they're like stops along the way of a procession. Or they're places where people leave things, offerings.
Over how far? What distance is this?
Let's see, the lines themselves about 4 or 5 kilometers wide,
Okay.
about 10, 15 kilometers.
And flat, so you could see other people on other lines adjacent to you?
All the lines are built to be seen from the ground. Also, the beginning of every line complex is a hill. It's either a natural or artificial hill. And we inevitably find structures up there that are ceremonial because they don't have any function other than, and they all, you can see the lines. There are places in Chincha where I stand on one of these initial structures and I can see 4 kilometers of line. And you can't see it today on the ground. And then when I say working the lines, every year people would come in and preparing the lines. They sweep them, they clean them up, they put more rocks, they get them pretty, right?
Yeah.
And I'm sure that there's this, keep up with the Joneses deal where my trapezoid's cleaner than yours, my trapezoid is cooler than yours, ours is bigger, come on over, we have more fun things to do here, we have more stuff to give away. So there's this competition that is going on constantly. And we know that they were always redoing the lines, always cleaning them up, right? That's like you were saying about dust coming in. They get very dusty, and so they have to be cleaned and swept.
Do the lines penetrate agricultural land?
Well, the lines we found are not in agricultural land, and if they were in agricultural land, we wouldn't see it anymore because they're all been plowed up.
Yeah.
There is some evidence that there were very long lines going to the major pyramid complexes in Chincha. And the evidence is in the form of some old air photos from the 50s, but also the streets today seem to converge on these big pyramid structures. And of course, when urban centers are built, people always do least cost effort. So where there's a road yesterday, that's where you put your road today, because it just makes a lot of sense. So my colleague, Henry Tantaleon, has published an article in which he claims that there are all these lines coming in to this one major Paracas site called Cumbe in Chincha. And I wasn't prepared to go that, to make those deductions, but he did. Good for him. So I think that he's probably right. He's usually right about everything. It's great. But I think that there were a whole series of lines that went all the way into the pyramid complexes. But again, this is the Paracas were master agriculturalists, so they were building these giant canals. And so they had to build these pathways, maybe with rock-lined paths or something like that, because you can't have a line in a field. It's just not going to work in an agricultural field.
Yeah. The reason I asked the question is because if the lines are in some ways related to another key factor, fertility, it makes sense to find these things penetrating farmlands and being associated with agricultural economy, but they're all in very arid climates, or is that only today?
Yeah, but remember, you have like in the North American Midwest, you have all these mound sites, right? Like Hopewell, and these are geoglyphs as well. They just can't. If you have a temperate environment, it rains, you can't build a geoglyph, so you build mounds, right? So they're functioning in the same way. So like if you go to Ohio and all the Hopewell mound structures, they're animal figures, they're built up. And so you walk on, the Maya built these giant causeways, which probably functioned, but also had some very clear ritual aspects as well.
You bring me to a conversation I had with Timothy Pocketat.
Oh, Tim, yeah, I know Tim.
Tim, I spoke to him 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, my buddy.
Oh, good stuff. What we talked about was the roads, causeways, geoglyphs. And I think a word, for a lot of reasons, encompasses these things is that they are ways.
Mm-hmm.
Something material travels a road, but a way suggests something much more esoteric. Do you think they functioned with seasons where perhaps in a rainy season the roads retained water, or are they just flat and defined with rocks at the side? Could you describe what one of these ways or geoglyphs actually is materially?
Okay, there's 2 kinds.
Okay.
One is we call extractive. So you go to the desert and you scrape it to the surface, to the bottom, usually maybe a foot.
A foot, okay.
Or not even that. And it exposes the white ground underneath. And the other way is what we call additive, where you just take rocks and you pile them up.
Yep.
There's a third way, which we call montecitos, or little tiny mounds, about a meter in diameter, about a half meter high. And you just line them up. And as you're standing on them, if you're looking uphill, they look like dots. But if you look downhill, they all merge together and they look like a line.
Okay.
So it's either, the utilitarian explanation is, well, they didn't have enough rocks, or they didn't want to spend too much time on it, so they just created the same effect by putting the piles of rock. And the more, I think, more sophisticated explanation is that these were intended to be walked down, not up.
Ah, yes.
You see. Because they're not a line looking up. They are a line looking down.
Yeah.
And going down in Chincha and almost every valley in the Andes that I've been in, you're going down to the big population centers. You're not going up.
And the population centers are around the coast. Is that what you're saying?
In the valley, yeah.
Okay. The Chaco Canyon archaeologists consider a gaming function with the causeways and the ceremonial ways there, whereby gambling was a huge function of social control around 1200. And have you considered any form of gaming aspect, whether it's races, ceremonial racing, like happened in Colombia before crowning ceremonies, they would race to exhaustion on roads? Has that been looked at in the context of Peru?
Ethnographically, we don't have a lot of evidence for that. We do find in Tiwanaku sites in Moquegua, way in the south, we find they look like they're llama phalanges. And they to this very day, people flip them if they stand up on edge, maybe 1 in 20 times, you win. We actually find these llama phalanges with a little cord tied around it.
Yeah.
To show the spot that's up. So they're probably doing something like that. If you read the ethnography of all these competitive feasts, people are doing just about everything. I mean, they're having a good time.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not going to get someone to go to Mardi Gras unless they're going to have a good time. And that's the whole point, is to, like, I tell a story. I was on the island of the sun. I think I mentioned this to you before. I was on the island of the sun the first couple of weeks. It was utterly beautiful, the most beautiful place on the planet. It's amazing. And then within 4 weeks, I started to miss food, because we had the same food every day and the same people every day and the same gringos every day and the same locals every day. And we started to get sick of each other. And by the 6th week, I was willing to move back to La Paz, in the dirty, grimy La Paz. So what people do in antiquity, because we have these big brains that evolved, like 200,000 years ago, we have these big brains and nothing to do with it. So we create sociality. We create a rich life. It's an understudied, under-theorized component of our human existence, is how people have to, for lack of a better term, party. They have to get together.
Yeah.
Yeah, you go nuts. You simply go crazy. And people have this amazingly rich social life in these small communities. Imagine looking at the same 300 people your entire life, unless you're a merchant or something. So you create the environment where new people come in, where you see new things. Exotic goods take on highly exaggerated value, right? All these different commodities, these different foods, spices, drugs.
Experiences, as you said, theater.
Yeah, you create theater, and it's amazing.
In Colombia, there was a resistance, an uprising from the Muiscas against the colonists, and the chroniclers recorded the last official Muisca ceremony. It occurred on the great conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter, and the festival was held by the Kazaki of Ubate. It's about 30 miles to the east of Bogota. The Spanish chronicler said there was 200 Spaniards present, and they were awestruck at estimated numbers between 20 and 40,000 indigenous from over 300
Wow.
territories around Colombia came to this. Charles, the description of what they were wearing. The Spanish said they wore oversized heads of parrots and ants and creatures native to their locations, and that they fell into what was called a borracho, which was 3 days on angel trumpet borrachera plants. But it was the number one tool and vessel to unite an entire indigenous country that had been at war with each other during the conquest and before it. But they used essentially theater, drugs, food, and dance to try to resist the Spanish. So, so important was theater. I think that word is so undervalued and underused in archaeology, but it seems to be quite important to you, doesn't it?
Very, very, very much so. Yeah, there's an emerging literature on that. Also, we discovered something. I'm glad you brought this up. You made me think about this. Me hace recordar. In a site up in the north coast called Las Aldas.
Oh, yes.
It has these big geoglyph complexes. So this site called Las Aldas, it was founded at least by 2000 BCE. It was really going strong around 400 BCE. But there are two geoglyphs that emanate out and go to a site 17 kilometers away called
Chanquillo.
Whoa, very good. So you got that. But the cool thing is, as you're walking up these lines up to Las Aldas, which I've done many times, and you get into the first plaza, then you get into the circular plaza, where the sun melts into the circular plaza during the solstice.
Amazing.
Perpendicular to the site. But then I remember it's right on the ocean, and the ocean is loud, and the site's way up the ocean, maybe 30 meters up. And so you can hear this wonderful ocean, just gorgeous, right? All around you. And then you go to the third platform and you walk in and suddenly it's dead silent. Dead silent.
An auditory threshold.
Then you go to the top. And as you're walking up and you get just near the top,
there you go.
It is cool. Now you look at the galleries in Chavin, you've probably heard about underground chambers.
Yeah.
They would release water into these underground chambers, and they would create this giant rumbling effect, and it was very theatrical, right? So they're playing with sound. Sound is also important, something we haven't figured out yet. They figured it out a long time ago. So they were acoustical engineers. They figured that out. And so I have a colleague who's going to come in from Spain, and she's going to go measure. She's an engineer, and she's going to go measure these sounds. So I think we have this theory that it's theatrical in the true sense of the word, also sound, right? So they're playing with sound. You can imagine if you have like a gaggle of 300-400 people down in the plaza, whooping it up and doing whatever they do. You can imagine that sound is amplified in a major way. And I've experienced this as well. At Tiwanaku, they have these big holes on the side of the wall, and you stick your ear in on the outside, and you can hear the noise amplifies. It's like a 19th century hearing aid, right? This is also going on. I mean, there are so many secrets we do not know about yet. There's so many things we haven't figured out. And I always used to tell my students, in anthropology, if you go to a people who are otherwise very successful and living a good life, and they're doing something that you think is very illogical and, quote, primitive, throw that out of your mind and figure out the underlying logic. And you touched on it by talking about these big costumes, people coming in and they're spending all this money. Well, you look at Mardi Gras, what's going on? There's all this social relationships and political alignments, and the elite do this, and the middle class do that, and the poor do that, and so it's mind-numbingly complex. It's really, really, really interesting, and these sites encode all that. It's just up to us to go figure it out.
Okay, back to Las Aldas, the alignment that connects the two sites, Chanquillo with Las Aldas. Is that a straight road, or does it diverge and bend?
No, it's very straight.
Over 17 kilometers.
Yeah, my mind, it's either 14 or 17.
Either way, that's a big effort.
Yeah, yeah. And the funky thing is, if you look at the original orientation of Los Aldos, and then you look at the linear geoglyphs that come out of it, there's a couple degrees difference. And they changed that just a little bit. And if you follow it, thank God for Google Earth, if you follow those lines, you go right to the village in Chonquillo, below the clock, the towers.
Yeah, yeah.
And they align perfectly with the village alignment. So you're walking right into that village, not in the fortress, but in the village below.
So the village is oriented on that alignment, the same axis.
Yeah.
And which was built first?
I think they're simultaneous, around 400. I think it's an early horizon phenomenon. Around 400 BC, yeah. That's I could be wrong. I could be totally wrong.
Okay, so there is an example of an alignment that was plotted by a group of people from one end to the other.
Yeah.
That brings me to a good question. In the Chaco Canyon, to try and determine which roads were trade routes and which were ceremonial, both being quite straight, they studied the compression of the roads.
Mm-hmm.
And you can make assumptions as to how sacred or ceremonial a road was by how least it was walked on, if you like. Have you thought about that in context of your region in Peru? Because I think it could be quite revealing which roads were walked on and which weren't.
Well, the geoglyphs oftentimes are built on old roads, old paths, I should say. So in Chincha, you have the paths that go all the way up into the Sierras.
Okay.
Huancavelica. So people are coming down, and so there's a point where you see two big rocks that they put, and then the two geoglyphs start, and that's right on the footpath that to this very day the people use to bring their cattle and their goats down into the valley. So I tend to see things as multifunctional. You see, I think you say, a fort in the American West, right, in the 19th century. Well, it wasn't just a fort. It was a fort. It was also a store, a church, religious area, an embassy. It was all these things. And you look at the Canterbury Tales, one of my favorite in Western literature. Some people go on to pray, some people go on to sell stuff. The Barber's Tale, what they're doing. I mean, people were doing all sorts of things, right? So I think it's a Western thing to categorize things as economic, political, and social. But in the rest of the world, things are kind of merged. So I would say like the Maya causeways, which I know better than the Chaco stuff. Chaco's fascinating. I've been there. It's utterly, but I defer to any expert on that one. But I would say those causeways are highly ceremonial, right? Because they're linking ceremonial centers. Yeah, there's no question about that.
And it's a long time after calendars were being developed, so these aren't. It's purely ceremonial. You know what Timothy said? You'll like this. When I asked him if the Rattlesnake Causeway at Cahokia was calendrical, where it actually served as a astronomer's tool, or was it purely ceremonial? He said, "Why do they have to be separate?"
Good man. That's why I like them.
We do. We have a tendency to create dualities where none exist, don't we?
Yeah. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that.
No, not at all.
But I mean, we in the West we work from Monday to Friday, and then on Sunday we go to church, or Saturday we go to synagogue or mosque, and then we separate. Mm-hmm. But in most societies, it's like religious service is also a social event, which is also a place where people have gossip and you exchange food and you feast and and you thank God for all this stuff. But we particularly in Anglo culture tend to really compartmentalize things, try to control.
Yeah,
it's not how the world does it.
Ibiza, the island, this elite island off the coast of Spain.
Yeah,
and each DJ has his own estate. They have silver trays overflowing with powders that I wouldn't know the chemical names of. And bedrooms with beds that I just would say are too big to sleep in. And I think what I'm describing is like cultish centers. Do you think this is the way to look at it?
Mm-hmm. I think from a a chronological perspective, yeah, you're going to see certain groups come and go. There's going to be all sorts of people. They're building geoglyphs everywhere. I mean, you have geoglyphs all through the Andes.
Yeah.
Not just in these big. There's all sorts of folks having their own two little. In fact, I was just studying one right before we called. It's just one line that comes down and it bifurcates into two and it goes to one site. And so everyone's doing this, right?
Okay. See this bifurcation in the Chaco Valley. The Rich Friedman has identified a pattern as such, where the alignments will often get to a part. There's an option of 3 routes, and he suggests, just like you, that this is perhaps a part of the theatrical element where the person working the roads perhaps had a choice or an option to make, whereas 2 of the roads end with no destination. 1 will continue on to the network, which I think is beautiful because it shows
that's fascinating.
User participation or player choice, if you like, if they functioned as such.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really fascinating observation.
And where a road is straight and it gets to the brow of a hill or maybe a threshold where the landscape falls away. Now that road could take a divergence to the left or right, but to the person walking the road who goes over the top of the hill and follows it, the perception is that he is walking a constantly straight road.
Oh, interesting.
Do you see anything like that? Do perhaps these Montanitas serve such purposes?
You've asked me a question I've never really thought about, and I think it's really insightful, and I need to take a look at that, which is a nice way of saying I haven't figured that out yet. That's really cool. It's interesting.
I think it is. While the road served a purpose once it was built, the act or process of building such a thing must have been hugely culturally important because of the labour and the man hours and the intention and the devotion. I think as well that maybe a ruler, a landowner, a farmer says, we're going to build this road from here to here.
Yeah.
Why, being the question would be asked, it's because it's 2 units longer than my great-grandfather's, which we've worn down to the dust. We can hardly see it any longer.
Yeah.
Do you see any signs of dynastic progression like you do in other landscapes? Like that, enhancements, extensions?
Well, yeah, in Nazca, you have it's a palimpsest, right? There's all the lines on top of lines, and what you see is the trapezoid, well, the linear geoglyphs go over the figures, and then the trapezoids go over the linear. So you can see a sequence in time.
Oh, yeah.
From figural geoglyphs on the landscape where people all come together to, with the rise of Nazca, the Kawachi, the main site, people are only congregating in one place. That's Kawachi now, not on the figures. So the figures go away. The purpose of the figures is to mark a place where people come together.
Okay,
right?
Yeah.
And if you get so big and large and your polity is so powerful that there's only one place you meet, that's in my town, then you don't need these other alternative places.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that idea of bifurcating and trifurcating is really fascinating.
I do feel there's a lack of focus on the emotions of humour and love and on these emotions that are fundamental to human existence. They found the underfelt of art and everything theatrical. And I just think to understand the roads or the ways that answers come from cultural interpretations here more so than archaeoastronomical. I think in this sense, the archaeoastronomy is a superficial perspective considering all of the things you've discussed. Would you agree with that, or do you think it's a fundamental aspect? Would you agree with that, or do you think it's a fundamental aspect?
Well, I think people have overinterpreted the lines in Peru, a Maya perspective, that there are these very sophisticated astronomically based calendars with priest kings, right? Astronomer kings. All the folks working at Nazca used to say that, Cossack, Ovini.
It's amazing to think about.
Yeah, it's great.
To visual. It's easy.
Doesn't quite hold up. I think that the lines and the alignments, the solstice is absolutely essential. We had discussed this previously that the one thing about the solstice is it's 294 degrees, give or take a couple. And it allows you to have a very precise period in time that you can mark. And if you're having these big feasts from all over the Pacific coastal watersheds in the Andes, you have to time it somehow. How do you know?
Yeah.
This is how you time it. So if you're 5 days walk away from Chincha and the festival's on this and such a date, you mark where the solstice, the sun is 5 days before this or that. It's a brilliant way to mark time. As you mentioned, there are so many moons away from this.
Yep.
So now we know when to begin. It also, like the Christian feast days, it structures the ritual, right? There's another aspect. I kind of get into it in my latest book, but how do you trust somebody if you work alone? Let's say one household makes their own pottery. They can make 10 pots a week, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
But if 10 households work together, they can make thousands of pots because it's an economy of scale. If you work alone, you have to get everything, the clay, the firing, make the oven. But if everybody does one part of that, specializes, then you can make vastly more. Now, if you make it yourself, you own it. The big problem is if a whole group makes it, who owns it? You see? And everybody wants their fair share, because if it's not fair, the whole thing falls apart. The whole cooperative labor organization falls apart. So what you do is you create these feasts, particularly for economic production that requires multiple steps over a long period of time. And okay, on this day, the sun's over there, and we do this. In 2 weeks, in so many suns, in 14 suns, it'll be over here, and then we have a feast, and then we get this back, and then we do this. And then at the end of all this ritual cycle, I get my stuff. I get my goodies. And it is fair. And in this way, people are willing to work, because as long as the leaders are following the prescribed ritual calendar and they're doing the right thing, it is, in most people's minds, inevitable that they will get to that final product.
Yeah.
And I think that this is really critical, because if you have a lot of friends and you can get them to come and bring stuff from their area that you need, that you don't have, and they want stuff from your area that, classic economic exchange theory, then you know that if you follow the ritual calendar, everybody wins. The cooperative labor organization holds. And if somebody is cheating, and they're always cheaters, somebody is cheating, you can pick it up because they're not following the ritual calendar.
The feast was taken to such a degree of perfection here latterly that when the Spanish arrived, they said even the common farmers were feasting 4 days a week.
Mm-hmm.
And because they had agricultural in such abundance and such surplus, because their systems, as you just said, the production systems and trading systems with Ecuador and surrounding countries, they were putting salt out and taking gold in, essentially.
Yeah.
But if you think about a people that could feast for 4 days a week with imported exotic foods from the Caribbean, maybe stuff from that they had never seen or smelled or tasted before.
Yeah.
Because we've all got friends who've got too much money for their own good, and they have toys that make you just love them.
Yeah.
They've just got a mystique, and we fall for it.
Yeah.
Our love of luxury.
Yeah. Well, in the ancient world, if you produce agricultural produce and you don't use it, it rots.
Yeah.
So how do you convert that into some kind of, quote, social currency? Well, you give it away. If you give it away, that's not illogical. You see, in a capitalist system, that's really illogical, right? Why would you just give the stuff away? But in a non-monetarized system, if you give it away, now you have a debt obligation.
You know something? There must have been so many farmers where the rulers came at the end of a season and said, "There you go. There's another 2 ton of maize." And they must have said, "Oh, balls, we're screwed."
Yeah.
We'll beware of gifts from strangers and friends.
Yeah. But I mean, that's kind of the basis of the economic basis of the origins of complexity and social complexity. Is so the Westerners would come in, they'd see these quackydoodle, the classic potlatching, and they're just giving all this stuff away, and they're throwing it away, and think, oh my God, these primitive peoples are so irrational, they're so dumb. Oh, what are you gonna do with it? You got like 8 rooms full of tarot. What are you gonna do with it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can't turn it into something permanent. You don't have money to put it in a box.
Yeah.
So you do something with it. Well, you create debt obligations among your friends. Specialization starts to take place. I'll tell you what, if you come and you go walk, you young guys, you go walk like 20 miles and get that really cool fish.
I'm not so young.
We'll feed you all the food you need, right? We'll give you the potatoes and the taro and the manioc and all this stuff. And you bring the fish back. Okay, good deal, because the young guys don't want to, weed gardens all day. They want to go out and find cool stuff. So specialization occurs. All sorts of social differentiation begins to develop in a positive way. Mm-hmm. And you get these wonderfully complex societies.
How did the people 1,500 years ago in the landscapes you've just described, how did they dwell? What was it? Were they a fishing people? Were they an agricultural people? Did they import their goods? How did they fundamentally exist before ritualization? What did they do for sustenance?
Okay, well,
that then influences their arts, theater, everything else. Now, we've talked about the actual theater and the actual rituals and the functionality, but why?
Yeah. Well, people very early on were hunter-gatherers, as you know, and they had semi-permanent camps where they would go to where there was resources that were really abundant.
Yeah.
But over time, what you begin to see is a differentiation into agricultural villages and fishing villages on the coast. So you have people who are clearly living on the coast and just getting lots and lots of fish. These what we call archaic shell middens, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, gazillions of shells. Now, they can't just be living on shells. You go nuts on mussels. You go out of your mind. So what they're doing is they're trading. They're clearly trading. But they're probably doing it through sociological relationships where the boy in the fishing village marries the girl from the agricultural village, and he moves there, and then the girl in the agricultural village marries the boy in the fishing village, and so then now their families have a relationship, and so it's by custom you exchange, right?
It's love again.
Love, yeah, that's right. I was thinking what you said, I was thinking we can find hatred in the archaeological record by deaths, but we can't find love, and I'm sure both were there, yeah.
Archaeologists confidently tackle violence and death statistics, but they don't turn to that other emotion,
Can't measure it.
It's because it's been hijacked by New Agers, and that's the truth. Yeah. You just can't.
Yeah, that's true. But to get back to your question, so you're going to have, what you're probably, this is my reconstruction, you're probably going to find lots of young people moving around a lot.
Yeah.
Moving goods and engaging in intensive feasting.
Yes.
I don't think they had the conception of the family like we do, where, I have my children, they're my children. I think children were everyone's children. Everyone took care of the kids. Kids ran around. Kids probably had a much better time than they do today. Didn't have to worry about their SAT test. And so you had lots of movement, and you had lots of exogamy, people marrying out. That was, and I don't think it's a genetic reason. I think people want to marry out. It just expands your social world. It might have had some positive medical effects, but I don't think I don't think care about that. Mm-hmm. So what you have is you have a landscape of settled villages, and then maybe some towns will emerge that are central places, and then usually this collapses. Most of these systems collapse. Once you get to towns, they tend to collapse pretty quick because of aggrandizers and people who are trying to take over the system. So there's a tension between collective action and what we call political economy. Collective action is you all work together and you don't have it. It's kind of an anarchy theory in a sort of way. It's kind of what I enjoy. And so in collective action theory, structures emerge to control labor and to control exchange, right?
Uh-huh.
But then this creates the basis for exploitation by an elite, and you get what's called a political economy, where you have an elite class begins to form, and they begin to create a middle class, usually based on military, or a specialist class that are dependent upon the elite. And then you see this intensive monument building, because the elites like to do that. And commoners like monuments because you have a good time, but it also reaches a critical point and it collapses. There's a reason states only emerged 7 times around the world in very few places. So what you have is, for most of the Holocene up to 2000 BC, something like that, you didn't have states. You had these complex pure polities, we call them, or chiefdoms, whatever I call them, intermediate polities that were kind of gurgling up and down in social and political complexity that they never quite reached the level of state. Once you hit the state, all the rules, not all the rules, many of the rules are over. Once you get an entrenched class that could control through military means and through monopoly of violence, everything shifts, and you see the complete collapse of the geoglyph political economy, the collapse of collective action.
Do you see the collapse of smaller communities as well?
Well, they're there, but they're now controlled a little bit. You see, so they can't voluntarily align with this group or that faction. You see a lot of movement prior to states where, okay, you can read the ethnographic literature from Africa. It's particularly rich, or Oceania. There are people to say, I don't like you anymore. We're going to take our people and go over there. Kind of like Beowulf, I don't like you. I'm going to go fight for that guy. But once you get states, you can't do that, right? You can't, because if you do, you're either going to go into some other state's territory and they're going to kill you or enslave you, or you're going to get beaten up by your own elites. So you see, not now from a big, broad perspective, states are very good at producing wealth. They're excellent at that. And they're very good at building the things that we attribute to civilization, which includes theater and religious structures and monuments and palaces and art and all that stuff. They're very good at that. But there's a price to be paid, as we know from Western philosophy for the last 2,000 years.
What's not sucked up into the political middle class is destroyed, leaving only the peasant class, right? The workers.
Right. Once you can create a group of people who are not agriculturalists, but who are dependent upon you, the elite.
Yeah.
You win.
Yeah, you've got it.
Because they become merchants, they become warriors, they become craftsmen.
Priests.
You win.
Yeah.
And that's when you begin to see palaces. A palace is defined as a place that's very restricted to a small group. Prior to states, everything's open. Everything's open. I mean, the whole idea is to encode fairness in your daily life, in your economic exchange, and to make sure everything is fair. Because if it's not fair, we know from evolutionary game theory and evolutionary psychology, if things are not fair, people bolt. They won't. I mean, all the irrational things we do on our own society, because we won't be made a chump. We won't be. Because it's not fair, right?
Yeah.
That's why when you say, they make a business decision is sucking it up and just, whatever, I don't care. I just pay this, even though it's not right. That's a business decision.
Please illustrate this. You quoted somebody who wonderfully wrote that little passage, and it concluded with "no beans, no Jesus."
Oh, that was me, yeah. That was my last chapter. No beans, no Jesus.
Could you just tell the audience that story? I think that is absolutely wonderful.
Oh, that's a absolutely lovely story. So there was a case, I think it was in like the 20s or 30s, in one of the pueblos in the American Southwest, Acoma or one of those. And this preacher, white guy, comes from back east, and he goes and he starts having these evangelical meetings, and everybody's coming, and everyone's having a good time.
Wow.
And he's preaching the word of God, and the people are into it. Yeah. And eventually, the attendance starts to drop off. And he goes to the one old guy who's still sticking around, and he says, "What happened?" And the old man says, "Well, you used to have food. You'd bring food. You were feasting. It was a reciprocal feast." He says, "But I'm giving you spiritual food. I'm giving you the Word of God." And the old man looks at him and says, "No beans, no Jesus."
It's just brilliant.
Yeah, I was worried of putting it in there, but Cambridge University Press said, yeah, if they decided it was okay, I guess it was respectable enough. Put that as my last chapter. But it's really important. Underlying most religious movements is a material basis of some sort. I don't want to be cynical. I'm not very religious myself.
No, but yeah, I'm just surprised to hear you saying most, because you'd have to come up with a great argument to say it wasn't all.
But I'm an academic. You never say all.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. My grandfather used to always say, the true God has an L in the middle.
What's that?
And that would be gold.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, it's true, isn't it? Charles, I want to ask you about a particular mound that you described or told me about, where perhaps a ruler stood atop it, and on the week around the solstice, you can see the sun sinking into that person. Could you describe that hierophany?
Oh, sure.
Because it's a great theater example.
Yeah, it is. It's a mound about, I don't know, like 20 meters long, about 10 meters wide. It's U-shaped, and it's perfectly oriented to the setting sun during June 21, the solstice, right? The winter solstice down there.
Yep.
And so I wanted to capture a photograph of the sun setting into it, and so I put up some orange cones that followed the precise orientation of the mound. And then we got there early, of course, and I was with some graduate students, and I got a chair, a bottle of beer, and I sat back about 50 meters from the mound to catch the setting sun with the camera. And meanwhile, the students went up there and they were discussing things, as students do. And as the sun was coming down, and it was hitting precisely, we knew it would hit it, obviously. So it was coming down. What I realized was, at least in the Pacific, when the sun sets, it doesn't melt right into the ocean. It melts above it for some phenomenon I don't understand. But it literally looks like it's falling into a mirror, right? So it doesn't go into the ground. It goes above the ground about a fist size from your thing. And I realized that this thing was built to include this incredible theatrical effect. If the whole crowd of people were where I was sitting, which would make sense because it was a big flat area, as the sun came down, it would be melting into people's heads.
Uh-huh.
It wouldn't go behind them, right? Like they wouldn't be silhouetted by the sun. The sun was melting into their head, and while they're still standing there.
So you're saying the visual horizon
Yeah.
is on where their head and the sun meets?
Yeah, it's melting on their head. It's not going down to where there's a silhouette. And so it is a spectacular impression, right?
I hate the word awesome. You guys use it too much.
Well, this is the true sense of awesome, awe-inspiring, right?
Ah.
See, it's awe-inspiring. And it's just melting over people's heads. And it lasts for a minute. It's one precise moment. So, like when I mentioned that Las Aldas way up north, you have this linear, very long rectangle.
Yeah.
Several hundred meters long and about 50 meters wide. And in the middle of these platforms that descend down, there's a big circular sunken court. It's about 20 meters diameter.
Mm-hmm.
So when you are directly perpendicular, perfectly perpendicular to the rectangle, and you're standing in this area, during the solstice, the sun melts into the hole. It's pretty cool, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's cool. And it's like, wow. It shows a level of sophistication in terms of manipulating the landscape to create what I call ritual landscape that is a lot more than we used to give them credit for. It's fascinating.
If you imagine between the persons taking part in the theatre and the audience, there was a David Blaine type magician character amping it all up and making sure people weren't looking at it until the right moment and making sure the guy was lined up and they were lined up.
Yeah.
There you have the beginnings of a priesthood, the person who controlled the functions of essentially the cycle of the sun and the ruler, really.
Yeah.
Which manifested or peaked in the time of the Incas, didn't it? Because after talking to you, the Incas didn't create anything. They just borrowed a bunch of shit from behind.
Yeah, it's true. The pre-Inca peoples were the Greeks and the Incas were the Romans. They just borrowed everything.
Yeah.
There's actually another site at the biggest site in the valley in this Cosma Valley where Los Altos is. It's called Sechin Alto.
Oh, yeah.
Sechin is oriented 66 degrees to the rising sun of the solstice. Perfect. So we discovered something. I'm proud of our team. I went back to the 2006 Google Earth, and the lines are still there. There are 2 lines that emanate out, just like at Los Altos, and they go all the way up, and they hit a geoglyph area, called Pampa Colorada. And there are these beautiful Paracas-like or early horizon-like geoglyphs. Then there are roads that come in on either end. Then there's a big rock with a geoglyph that goes that way. I went up there, bingo, 294, right? Setting sun. So you're standing, and this is about 10 kilometers away. If you're standing in Sechin Alto, and again, it's a massive Los Altos. It's absolutely huge, like 500 meters long.
Isn't it the largest structure in the Americas?
Yeah, at that time. Yeah, it's huge. Yeah. So as you're standing there, what you have is, I believe, you have all these people coming in during the solstice. They're meeting at the geoglyph, because that's what geoglyphs are, a meeting place.
Yeah.
They're doing their who's what's-its, and then they're coming down, and there are all these geoglyphs off to the side, and the sun is coming up over their head. That's pretty cool, right? I mean, that's like cool. So, again, it's a giant theatrical landscape that you're creating. We do it better than anybody.
An obvious next question arises, Charles, and it's, I don't want to get too deep for the audience, but what's a who's what's it?
Lo de más.
Yeah, okay. Are you aware of Dr. Ed Bernhardt at the Maya Discovery Center?
No, I'm afraid I don't.
Okay, he's an no, he's going to hate that. He's an archaeologist who likes archaeoastronomy, who mapped Palenque, and we talked extensively about the zenith, Charles. Hugely important in the Khmer temples in Cambodia, Mayan temples, more so than the solstices. Here in Colombia, it's the 5th of April. But have you noticed any alignments to the zenith on the horizon there? Because you are in the tropics, and the day of no shadow, when that sun's above you, was arguably more sacred here than the solstices.
Yeah. Interesting. No, I do not. I haven't looked, though. They may be there. Have you talked with Benfer? Yeah, right, his name. He's an interesting fellow. You'll like him.
Okay.
Unlike me, he's not afraid to go out on a limb and speculate.
Skip the light fandango.
Yeah, he sees alignments everywhere, I'll warn you. But yeah, he's a cool guy. I love him.
I don't know about you, but when I was in my 20s, and like many of the people I spoke to, we all saw alignments everywhere. And I was out with dowsing rods. I thought they were ley lines until I was 30, and then I grew up, but I think you have to see lines everywhere to even be interested in one, to be interested in any of it.
That's true.
There's actually a society today online. There's a record for how far we can walk on a straight line without 3 meters deviation left or right, and they have to do it with GPS. And the record at the moment is 16 miles across, I think, northern Italy. A guy was able to walk in a straight line. But doesn't that just perhaps suggest that in every culture, in all times, there were certain humans who just loved doing stuff in straight lines.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, it's quite a challenge to do anything straight.
I know. When I was in college, I took a class on orienteering. Right, this is in the 70s, a long time ago. But we were all tested to see how well could we follow that straight line.
There you go.
So we were given an orientation, but we weren't allowed to use the compass. Say, okay, you got to go that way.
So you had to make backsides.
And most people, and me too, we had a deviance to the right.
Oh, yeah.
We always prefer going to the right. So we overcompensate by what we think. Because you look at a horizon, it was in middle Pennsylvania, so you had a lot of landmarks. So the idea was you stand there, says, okay, see that, go toward that mountain. You know, you think, oh, it's easy. But some people, like a bird, they figure it out.
There's no one or two astronomers with plumb lines that can do that. What you maybe have is 6 or 7 people. Because if 6 or 7 people pull an alignment, you'd actually be quite amazed how accurate the average is.
Wisdom of the crowd. Well understood phenomenon. Very well understood phenomenon, yeah.
A psychologist put a jar on his table, his desk, and he filled it with gumballs.
Mm-hmm.
And every day for a year, he asked people sitting in his chair to guess how many gumballs were in the jar.
Mm-hmm.
And he had guesses ranging from 70 to 7,000.
Yeah.
Say there was 4,000 in there. After 5,000 guesses, the average estimate was one gumball off 401,000.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a phenomenon in the stock market as well.
Is it really?
Yeah. Yeah, they know that. I mean, so you'll have people who are super gamblers, people who are super conservative, and the market is basically people guessing as to which way a certain commodity is going to go. And the crowd gets it right. That's average. Half lose, half win. Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating.
I've got to ask you a question about you. The ultimate goal of every archaeologist starting out is to dig up something significant. And while there's great dopamine drips to be got on Google Earth, finding a line, nobody cares.
Yeah.
But you found a feather medallion, didn't you?
Yeah, that was pretty impressive. It's at a site called Cerro del Gentil. I didn't excavate it. My colleague, Henry Tantaleon, and his team excavated it. I happened to be there. But we were excavating in a temple, sunken court. Mm-hmm. And this artifact pops up. Thank God our crew were so experienced. And it turned out to be an unfired clay medallion, about the size of maybe a big silver dollar, if you remember those. And it was a molded bird face with beans for eyes, and and they took the wet clay and they stuffed in yellow and blue feathers, and then they put a rope on it, and it was a necklace. So it was like, a modern singer, in a rock band.
It's incredible.
And it was perfectly preserved. It's utterly gorgeous.
But those two colors, the yellow and the blue, that's a classic macaw. That's an Amazonian macaw, the blue and the yellow.
Yeah, oh yeah. Yeah, we were hoping that the feathers were from the Amazon forest. That would have added to the story, but they're not.
There must be Amazonian imports there, though.
Yeah, we did a very a chemical study of the strontium ratios in 39 organic objects that were put in the temple.
Oh yeah,
and they come from all over, from the highlands, from the coast, from local, from very far away. So the so-called catchment zone of the temple itself was all over the Andes. And remember, each of these four big mounds where all the lines converged on, they had their temples. And so they were all doing this. And we believe they were simultaneous, which is extremely cool. Mm-hmm. Not sequential. I thought it would be sequential, but it wasn't. They're all functioning at the same time. Classic competitive feasting cooler ring.
Do you think those geoglyphs were a forerunner to the Incas' Sique system in Cusco?
That's there are people who will swear on their mother's grave that it's Seke-like system. I don't buy it.
Why?
Well, there's a big issue about the Seke system as well. My colleague Brian Bauer, who I believe you're going to interview.
Indeed, hopefully in the next couple of weeks.
Brian actually did a major path-breaking study of all the Seke monuments, the called wakas, and they are not on straight lines. They're not even close.
No.
And Brian concluded that the Seke system was an abstract thing, like north, south, east, and west. But it, except in very rare occasions, it was some kind of organizing principle in Inca society. There was, I think, 42 lines, 41, something like that.
41.
But I think that that's an abstract organizational principle of a complex state society with a professional philosopher class and a professional, whatever you want to call them, scientific class. And what you see down in the lines, particularly the Nazca lines, are what we call ray centers. That's what Avini and his team called them, or line centers, ray centers. But these are low hills, artificial or natural, that where lines converge on. So you converge and you leave. You converge and you leave. Is just because it looks like a Seke system, we wouldn't say, oh, they invented the bicycle wheel. Just because something's morphologically identical doesn't mean that they function in the same way. And this is where I think the logic breaks down with that. Yeah, they look like a Seke. Okay, but so does a bicycle wheel, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of times people, professionals included, jump to conclusions based upon morphological similarities. And there's this whole concept, which I'm sure you're aware of, called equifinality, right? Things will start out very differently. Well, they may end up at the same place, but they're not related, okay? Yeah, so I don't see it, but again, I'm a hard guy to convince. I really want hard data.
Tom Zeidema presented a paper, and it got me 20 years ago. I looked at it and I saw the first introduction to this system from the Chincha temple, and he presented his paper with straight lines, which from 500 miles in the air might have looked straight, but that's the smoothing effect, because as you say, when you zoom in and try and draw those lines in Google Earth, they just don't exist. They're hypothetical.
Yeah, they don't work.
But you'd get shot if you did that. If you showed us a line that wasn't straight as straight, you wouldn't get away with that today.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, but my point is that if you get a little esoteric here, Zeidema was a structuralist.
Yeah.
And he's a European guy, who's Dutch or something. And I knew him well personally. He was in Illinois, I was in Chicago, and we interacted a lot. But structuralists have to have the system has to be perfect, right? It's an ideal system. It's a Cartesian system. It's perfect. The data aren't very important to them. And that's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
Like physicists and mathematicians are like that. But people like me, we come from more of a Baconian tradition, and that the data have to drive interpretation. So for Zeidema, I remember he and I were in Copacabana in Lake Titicaca, and he had this thing called the anti-zenith.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I said, Tom, what the hell is that? He goes, well, that's when the sun is, on the other side of the earth. And I said, and I'm thinking, okay, he's well respected. They were structuralists, right?
Yeah.
They made the structure fit. It had to be perfect, okay? Whereas empiricists like me, we're deductive, hypothetical deductive. The data, when the data contradicts what your idea, you change your idea.
Yeah.
You see, and things aren't as pretty. They're not as elegant. Now, they would say, like Levi-Strauss and all the other structuralists, they would say, what we're getting to is the underlying and profound logic of the system. What the physicist, I was at Santa Fe Institute, which is a very highfalutin think tank. I was there for many years. And the physicists there would look at us, lesser mortals who weren't in physics, and say, we peer into the soul of God.
Oh,
You mere mortals measure stuff. We create. Okay, hey, I like it. I dig dirt and you find God. Okay. So, but it's a whole different way of viewing science, right? It's a whole different way. And you need both. You absolutely need both. But by the time Tom got to the anti-Zenist thing, he had to have it to make it fit. It had to be symmetrical, right, in his mind. And I'm thinking, well, gee, I don't buy that.
Why you would ever make that cosmologically significant, because it would only be known by a select amount of people. But I'm glad I asked you about it, because...
Yeah, like we divide things into tall, medium, and short. That's just completely arbitrary, right? And they were organizing something, right? They were organizing something, But to move it to some kind of fundamental template of Inca cosmology, I think is a bit of a leap. Let me leave you with one.
Go on.
I get a lot of my colleagues can't stand the ancient astronaut crowd and the pseudo-archaeologists. I don't dislike them. I think in our world, since 1800, the world has become fabulously rich. Materially, I mean, this has been astronomical. And you have to be nuts to say that, regulated capitalism hasn't given us riches beyond our wildest dreams. We live longer than we ever did, or we're healthy.
Yeah, that alone.
This is true. Materially, we've never been better. But I think what's missing, it began in the mid-19th century, is mystery. We don't have mystery. Some people find it in religion, but then they get cynical because religions sometimes get greedy. But there's a whole group of people out there who are not religious, who don't buy it, but who crave mystery. And they hate experts. They hate scientists who take away all the mystery of the world. And they come in, and I think that there is an appetite out there for, like, ancient world is the perfect place where you can find mystery, because you can never prove things. You can prove negatives, but you can't prove positives, right? And so what you have is, it's the opposite. You can't prove a negative. You can prove positives, right? So I think that there's a whole group of people out there who are so desperate to have some deeper, profound mystery in life.
I agree.
That they turn to these fantastical views in archaeology as a way to, just make their life meaningful. And I can't fault them for that. I admire those people. I get letters all the time, emails, I have this site called Band of Holes. We haven't talked about it, but it's a really cool site. And people are just, the craziest ideas. They're amazing. And they're within the realms of reality, right? They're not like astronauts and things. And I write to them, and I have a whole template. And I send it back, say thank you very much, and I interact with them. And far too many of my colleagues are too cynical. They're too mean. Too mean-spirited, and they feel like their life's work is being denigrated by amateurs who don't know what they're talking about. And I really reject all that. And I think that we like you, and what you do is very important, and it's extremely high quality.
Thank you.
I think you're really doing an important thing to get those folks in and let them hear the rational academic side, but without taking away that little bit of emotion,
Charles, thanks so much for coming and joining me.
All right, man. Thank you very much. I learned a lot. Talking with you, so thank you as well.
If you enjoyed this episode, hit subscribe, drop a 5-star review, or share it with a friend. And you can get in touch with me through historyfuzz.com.